Hello boys and girls, and welcome to See It Twice. I am the Gourd King, and I am very happy to have you here. If you enjoyed this video, I do hope that you will like, subscribe, and share. Not too long ago, I launched this channel with live streams of my first time playing Cuphead. Since its release, this game has gained a well-earned reputation of being one of the hardest in recent memory, and thankfully one of the most fun as well. Having beaten the game recently, and having gone back through it a couple of times, I present to you my own personal ranking of Cuphead's many excellent bosses. But before I begin, I want to establish the fact that my rankings are neither arbitrary nor based merely on memory. I combed over my videos and literally counted the number of attempts it took for me to defeat each boss on my first run through regular difficulty, then kept track of them when I played again going for the A grades, and then once again while playing on expert difficulty. I assigned point values for each ranking for each playthrough, then took the total number of deaths and divided by 3, and then added those points to each boss's then existing total. Some of the results might surprise you, some even surprise me, but I think this will, at the present time, honestly reflect my own experience with each boss fight in the game. And with that, let's get started with part 1 of my personal ranking for Cuphead's bosses. Coming in at the bottom of this list is the very first boss I fought, the Root Pack. While fun for a first fight, the Root Pack is a complete and total pushover that I had absolutely no trouble beating on either difficulty or when going for an A grade. Whether I was jumping over dirt balls against the potato, avoiding the tears of a weepy onion, or dodging baby carrots and mind ripples from the giant carrot, the Root Pack didn't manage a single kill against me in any of my 3 runs. So after slicing and dicing my way through them with ease, all I need now is a bone and some broth.
Baby, you got a stew going.
At number 26, we have our first DLC boss, Angel and Demon. Unlike most of the other foes on this list, this pair only comes in 1 difficulty and with no grades, so my ranking is based on just 1 encounter. This boss has an interesting concept where the attacks coming at you from the demon are determined by which direction you're facing, while from the opposite direction come the harmless attacks from the angel. If you change the way you're facing, the harmless attacks turn harmful, while the harmful attacks turn harmless. Definitely a cool idea, but not at all difficult to overcome. In fact, I managed to win by mostly staying rooted in one part of the boss arena and waiting for the line of fire to come at me before turning to make it harmless. Sure, this might lead to some damage if you don't time it well, and could lead to a few deaths as it did me. But there's a good chance that if you've waited to go to the DLC island for a while, you've got a pretty excellent collection of HP boosts and powers that should make this encounter a breeze. Coming in at 25 is Goopy Legrande. Similar to the Root Pack, Goopy is one of the game's easiest bosses no matter what difficulty I was playing. While he did manage to score a few kills on me as he bounced around the arena during his first phase, once I got past that, his second phase as a tombstone sliding from left to right was really simple. He makes a few passes and then stops where you're standing, and you simply dash away before he lands on you. I should note that since parrying is required to receive an A or S grade, be on the lookout for when the 3 question marks appear over Goopy's head, as this is your lone opportunity to get the necessary parries. Aside from that, this is probably the most conceptually simple boss in the game, and of course, one of the easiest. Next on the list at 24 we have Captain Brinybeard. I think I should note that the gap in difficulty between this entry and the previous 3 is pretty massive to say the least. The most that any of the previous 3 bosses killed me with Scoopy was 7 over the course of 3 playthroughs. From here on, every one of the boss fights left on this list racked up a minimum of a dozen kills each, and some plenty more. As for Captain Brinybeard, he's obviously who I found to be the easiest of the remaining bosses, but also one of the most fun. While one is likely to die a few times to him, each attack of his has pretty obvious tells to learn and strategies to avoid damage. The first phase is a cakewalk as Briny shoots pellets at you from a pink octopus while a barrel slowly moves back and forth, a hazard that remains throughout the fight but isn't too big of an issue. The next phase stacks the attacks of the first one on top of the captain summoning various animals. There's a squid whose ink can obstruct your vision, a shark that can be avoided by simply moving next to Briny's ship, and a group of dogfish that you can kill or jump over. And watch out when the ship starts chewing because he'll soon begin shooting cannonballs. Briny's final phase is mostly pretty easy. You still have to watch out for the overhead barrel, but there's a sweet spot at the foremost post where you can duck down and avoid all of the rest of the attacks while you attack the ship's uvula and send Briny down to Davy Jones's locker. Tied for the number 22 spot, we have Calamaria of the Astral Clock. Nope, sorry, thinking of another game. I mean Calamaria. Now, I know that if you've ever watched other Cuphead boss rankings before, then there's a pretty good chance you've seen Maria ranked much higher. And yet for whatever reason, my own playstyle proved highly effective against her. Now, my first time taking her on was a pretty tough challenge, and for a little while I thought I'd end up having just as difficult a time beating her as most of the other players I'd seen. But once you learn her attacks and how to dodge them, I honestly don't think she's very hard, even when you get to expert difficulty. In fact, Calamaria only managed a single kill against me on my first expert encounter with her, which went a long way in determining the spot she occupies on this list. I think a big part of the reason is that aside from the higher quantity of the same enemies, her expert difficulty fight just really isn't all that different from the regular difficulty, so the strategy to beating her simply didn't change all that much. It certainly feels odd to me to place her last among the game's several plane battles, given her reputation, but based on my own experience, that's simply where the gal lands. And speaking of planes and plane battles, tied with Calamaria at 22 we have the Howling Aces, and again, you might be surprised to see them this low if you've watched other lists. Similar to Calamaria, my first time fighting the Aces on regular difficulty proved much more difficult than coming back to the fight later on Expert, and for similar reasons. The same reason, in fact, as the Expert difficulty fight really isn't strategically different from the regular difficulty fight. You start by firing away at the pilot while dodging bones, tennis balls, and balls of yarn. The second phase, where you jump over or parry the letters of the phrase bow wow, is one of the game's easiest. You keep yourself out of the path of various lasers in the third phase, which also isn't too tough, and then in the final and hardest phase, the screen starts to flip on you while you attack Pilot Saluki and avoid dog bowls. That final phase is pretty disorienting at first, and was responsible for most of my deaths against this boss, but once you're used to it on regular difficulty, it isn't really different on Expert. Now don't be fooled into thinking that either the Howling Aces or Calamaria are exactly easy, as that can really only be said about 3 or 4 of the game's bosses. But relative to the other foes I faced in Cuphead, these two fights, while 2 of the most fun, didn't prove to be as consistent a challenge as most of the rest. At number 21 is Beppy the Clown. I think the best way for me to describe the difficulty this boss presented to me was consistently moderate. I would even say that Beppy can be quite a brutal challenge if he pairs certain attacks with the oncoming train, which creates circumstances that border on being unfair. For the most part, each phase of his is pretty straightforward when it comes to how to strategically overcome it. The first phase requires that you simply fire away and stay on the opposite side to him as he moves his bumper car towards and away from you, taking care to knock out the ducks overhead so they don't remain obstacles for when he changes sides and you have to jump over him. The second phase is tougher as he sends inflatable dog heads at you, while the train periodically passes through, causing you to have to fight on a moving platform. For his third phase, the train does the same thing and Beppy comes down either on the left or the right of the screen on a horse, and fires horseshoes in varying patterns. If the train isn't passing through, your best bet is to get underneath him and fire away. If it is, then I don't know what to tell you, as this spelled certain doom for me, or at least drained a good amount of HP as I tried to wear him down. His final phase, thankfully, is much easier to manage, and if you have 2 or more HP remaining, then you should be just fine. I found it best to mostly hop from platform to platform above ground, and then keep an eye on the little guys who throw baseballs at you. Truth be told though, there is something about the animation in this phase which, for me, is pretty distracting, and often proved detrimental. It also seemed to me like Cuphead sort of blended into the background, and there were occasions where I briefly lost him. It could be the color palette or the way Beppy fills the screen or the rush of the carousel and train, but either way, it's something to be mindful of. So long as I stayed focused, however, Beppy proved that, while not an easy challenge, he was at least a fairly manageable one. Coming in at number 20 is the Phantom Express, and honestly, seeing my formula place this boss over any of the previous 3 kind of makes me question the whole thing, because this boss's difficulty took an absolute nosedive after the first time I faced him. Even the final phase, which I've heard a number of players say they struggled with, was never much of an issue for me. So how did it end up here, you might ask? Well, I think what happened is that I died a lot in my first encounter because I simply chose poor loadouts that made me ill-equipped to deal with the first phase. I tend to get pretty comfortable with equipment, and at this point in the game, I had grown really fond of the chaser weapon, and it had become my go-to for most fights. While I did ultimately overcome the Phantom Express primarily with this weapon, once I came back and was using ones like Crackshot and especially Converge, this boss went from being a challenge to a pushover. The first phase consists of bouncing eyeballs and the winged members of my Gordish brethren dropping pink ingots from above in an attempt to move your train cart closer to the ghost. Just out of curiosity, how do I look with wings? The second phase features a giant skelly conductor trying to give you the smash. I recommend resetting your cart to the middle after each attack and then adjusting to whichever train car his head comes out of. And again, be mindful of the pumpkins. Following this, a pair of pistons called the Lollipop Ghouls emerge from the train. Once again, keep to the middle so it's easier to adjust to whichever side is safest. As soon as one of the pistons rears back, parry your wheel to move over to the opposite side and just keep to the end of your cart. There are also some ghosts flying around that have taken the place of the pumpkins, and when you shoot them, pink skulls fall from them, so be careful where you shoot them because they'll parry your cart over. In the final phase, which I mentioned earlier, the locomotive gets legs, and you're required to parry off of its tail in order to open up the coal door, inside of which reveals the Phantom's heart, which is the only part of him that takes damage. Be careful to avoid the fireballs and spinning bone attacks, which can be tough to deal with if you're not paying attention. However, there's a good chance that you've had to dodge far more objects on screen in other fights, so I honestly think this is pretty easy to manage. So long as you've come well equipped, you'll probably only need to open his coal door 2 to 3 times before you walk away victorious. At number 19, we have Ribby and Croaks. This boss battle has the special distinction for being the first one I died to over 10 times. The design of the fight is fairly simple, but until one recognizes the patterns, it's pretty effective in its challenge. In Phase 1, you'll have to handle Croaks spitting fireflies that slowly come at you, but they're relatively easy to deal with. Meanwhile, Ribby spins his fist to throw shockwaves your way. On regular difficulty, these attacks aren't particularly hard to deal with individually, as you might be noticing from the footage, but on Expert you'll need to juggle both attacks at the same time. Your best bet here is some kind of tracking weapon like Chaser or Crackshot to deal with the fireflies, and as for the shockwaves, all one really needs to know is that starting from the left they go in a pyramid-like pattern. Phase 2 is a bit easier with the frogs being on either side of you. Croaks turns into a fan trying to force you over to Ribby, while Ribby throws 3-ringed balls at you. On Expert, Ribby will also do a half version of his shockwave attack, so be mindful of that. But this is probably still the fight's easiest phase. Once you've damaged them enough, leap over Ribby as he rolls towards you and into Croaks' mouth. Upon eating his brother, Croaks morphs into a giant slot machine, just like frogs do in real nature. Coins will fire at you, about a second apart and in whatever spot you're currently in, be it on the ground or in midair, which makes them easy to manipulate. Parry off of the handle once it turns pink, and it's on to what is probably the most challenging portion of the fight. The slots will land on either bulls, tigers, or frogs, each of which coincides with a type of platform. Bulls mean that the platforms will have a blue flame either on their top or bottom, meaning you'll have to stay on the ground or jump over them to avoid damage. Tigers mean the platforms come equipped with bouncy balls for you to avoid as they come towards you. Frogs mean you're getting standard platforms, but at a faster pace than the other two kinds, so adjust accordingly. These platform sequences are the only part of the final phase where the boss takes damage and will continue until the fight ends, so keep those dodging and shooting skills sharp and you'll be home free. At number 18 is the King's Gauntlet. Like Angel and Demon from earlier, this fight has 1 difficulty and no grades. The 5-part collection of bosses are based on chess pieces, and you defeat them with the parry mechanic rather than weapons. Before you take on the gauntlet, you will get to face each chess piece by themselves. This ranking score is based on my sole attempt at the gauntlet and the deaths I suffered when fighting each piece individually. The good news about it is that while you do have to complete each fight victoriously and consecutively or start again, your health does reset after each fight. I highly recommend using Miss Chalice for these fights, as her parry move is the most effective in the game and the fastest. The gauntlet begins with the pawns, who are the easiest of the bunch. There are 8 of them, just like in chess, and they leap down from the platform above and simply run in whatever direction you're standing from them. The objective is to parry off each of their noggins and you'll emerge victorious. Keep in mind that just because you've taken the head off of one doesn't mean that they're out of the fight, so you will have headless pieces coming at you and trying to deal you damage. All the same, this fight is as straightforward as it gets. The second member of the gauntlet is the Knight, and he's definitely got the highest learning curve and the most HP. You're required to parry off of his main 20 times, so patience is the name of the game. His standard swipe attack leaves a brief opening for a single parry, but if you've decided not to use Miss Chalice, you're better off not even trying. His wide slash, once completed, leaves him open for 1 to 2 hits, just make sure you're not in his way when he swings his sword. His third attack is a forward thrust, which you can leap over and land 2 to 3 more parries on him, and is probably your best window overall. 20 parries later, and he's off the board. The third member was, for me, the hardest of the bunch, and that is the Bishop. The Bishop moves around the stage in straight and undulating patterns and leaves bells around the arena that will track and fire at you. So those are your obstacles to avoid. On top of that, your objective is to snuff out the lit candles to make the Bishop's head available to parry, and that number of candles increases with each hit. 8 parries later, and the fight is won. Following this, you'll take on the Rook. The Rook fires a collection of skulls, sparks, and pink parryable heads at you, so your task is to play volleyball with the heads and knock them back at the Rook. If you time your hits and the trajectory right, each takes about 1 to 3 hits to fire back at him. This isn't too difficult, but it's also not easy with various hazards being fired at you on top of the heads themselves. Score 8 hits and you'll be 1 fight from absolute victory. To cap things off, you'll take on the Queen, and they've saved the best for last and thankfully not the hardest. While there are a good number of objects to avoid, and while parrying the cannons when they're pointed at her can be a bit tricky, this is a really fun encounter, and the skills you've acquired over the course of the game should prevent you from needing too many attempts to defeat Her Royal Highness. The individual encounters with each of these chess pieces are obviously your best resource for learning how to beat them. It can be a challenge to string together the 5 straight victories to overcome the gauntlet, and the overall length of it will probably test your patience, but it's one of the game's most manageable challenges. 17 on this countdown is the Moonshine Mob. I've watched several lists that speak ill of this DLC boss, and for the life of me I don't understand why, as I actually think this is one of the game's most entertaining bosses. The first phase has you jumping or dropping from level to level as you attempt to take out the spider boss. There is a good amount of smaller enemies and obstacles to avoid or take out, but with the right weapons and good timing, this isn't too bad, especially on regular difficulty. On expert difficulty, the fight is certainly a good deal harder, but not so much as to elevate it to the levels of the game's most challenging baddies. Phase 2 is a bit easier, and your skills at dodging the laser attack is likely to prove just how effectively you can get through it. Just avoid being out near the edges of the screen when it goes off, because that's the easiest way to end up getting killed. There are some enemies and dancing barrels that you'll need to avoid or kill, but with a good loadout, they're not an issue. The final phase is definitely the easiest, as you really just need to stay on the opposite side of the aardvark, and be sure to avoid his tongue. When he fires a ball of brawling insects, that's your cue to move to the side. Now I should note that there is a way to make this phase significantly harder, and that's if you're using just about any weapon other than the chaser, as shooting the bouncing ball of insects is the key to ending the phase. Without this weapon, this can take quite a bit longer and will almost certainly change your approach, which can only make things more challenging. And finally, don't be fooled by the false knockout sign that appears after the aardvark phase. Jump up to the platform that levels you with the snail, and after a few seconds of shooting, the fight is won. Baroness von Bonbon is next, which I guess makes 16 rather sweet, huh? All bad jokes aside, the Baroness has encounters that can range from fun to fair to frustrating to fairly facile. This is largely dependent on the opening phase, where Bonbon unleashes 3 of 5 possible minions against you, and those minions are as follows. There's a giant jawbreaker who basically just follows you around and is not too bad as long as you mind your distance. A giant candy corn who can be a bit of a pain as he moves up and across and changes direction with little warning. Or perhaps you'll fight a cupcake whose hazardous splashes and diagonal leaps can be incredibly frustrating to avoid. Then there's the walking gumball machine, who is probably the easiest if you can effectively dodge the little gumballs he shoots from his head. And finally, there's the flying waffle, who is also pretty easy if you can keep to the opposite side of the screen and avoid his spread attacks. On top of getting a trio of this lot to deal with, there are also small jelly beans coming at you on the ground that you'll need to keep an eye on, both for the purposes of parrying and avoiding. Following these fights, you take on the Baroness herself. The giant peppermint that rolls out from her castle is something to be mindful of, but you can easily avoid it by hopping onto the platform or just parry off of it as many times as you please. The attack you have to be most careful against is the homing missile that is her severed head. The wider your back and forth movements are, the more time you'll have to attack the Baroness before you have to avoid the head. Overall, Bonbon didn't present too big an obstacle for myself, but given the random nature of the trio of enemies you're obligated to face in Phase 1, the difficulty of the fight tends to vary a fair amount. Taking the 15th spot is Cagney Carnation. This ferocious flower was pretty tough for me on my first go, but like most bosses, gets much easier on subsequent playthroughs. Of the early game bosses, what makes Cagney so tough is the high variety of attacks he possesses in comparison to the others in Inkwell Isle 1. In his first phase, Cagney has two primary attacks where he'll either lunge across the upper or lower part of the screen, or shoot seeds up into the air that become enemies after they've landed. In Phase 2, Cagney adds to these attacks a couple of others, as he'll fire homing acorns or boomerang seeds. These become easier to manage with better loadouts that you acquire later in the game, but early on, when it's just you and a pea shooter, it can be a challenging bout. In his final phase, Cagney will begin using his roots to make the entire bottom of the arena a danger area, while also attacking 2 of the 3 platforms, followed by spitting out dandelions at you. Similar to Phantom Express, I recommend getting onto the middle platform so you can more easily adjust to wherever Cagney is about to attack. For new players, this bevy of different attacks could feel a bit overwhelming, but it's honestly one of the game's most helpful bosses in the long run, since it kind of becomes par for the course later on to have to deal with many objects on screen at the same time. Cagney's certainly not too hard once you've beaten him on regular difficulty and more or less learned the elements of the fight, but for you first-time players, he could very possibly be an early hurdle, which, in the long run, will only make you better at the game. Sitting right in the middle of the pack at 14, we have Werner Vermin, whom I think is somewhat of an underrated boss both for his fun and his difficulty. Granted, he's much like the bosses beneath him in that he was only difficult on my first playthrough, but his is a fight that offers a good test of all of your platforming skills, be it jumping, dashing, parrying, dodging, placement, and overall attentiveness. In his first phase, Werner will either use a cannon or catapult against you to fire either bombs or debris. He'll fire 2 pink springboards onto the ground, and as soon as he stands up completely straight, be ready to parry off of one of them and hop over him. Once that phase is ended, Werner will stay in the middle of the screen and move periodically between the upper and lower portions of the screen. This is your cue to be on whichever level he isn't, as he'll soon unleash his flamethrower. Be mindful of the bottle cap buzzsaws as you move around and avoid the flames, and the phase should be over in no time. In his final phase, Werner is swallowed up by a giant cat. You'll see the cat reach one arm over to one side of the screen, and you'll need to move over to the other so you don't get slapped. After this attack, the impact will cause wooden planks to fall to the floor, so be sure to dodge those. The cat will also be flanked by either 2 or 4 ghosts, depending on the difficulty, and one of them will lob a ball at you that will split into 2 smaller balls that you'll have to leap over on impact. Each of Werner's 3 phases is fairly moderate in overall difficulty, and the variety of the overall challenge can lead to a good number of deaths when you're first trying this boss out. Once you've got each phase down, I think you'll find this to be a fun challenge the same way I did. And that'll do it, ladies and gents, for part 1 of this boss ranking list, as we are 14 deep and have reached the midway point. Once again, I would like to thank you all for watching. Please stay tuned for the release of part 2 of the list, where I rank bosses 1 through 13. And also, be sure to be on the lookout for much more to come on See It Twice. Until then, God bless you, and goodbye.